Hey, I hope y'all don't mind, but I'm gonna let the reader here do it. I keep messing up today. I don't know what's wrong. I'm probably just overtired because we've had a lot of stuff going on. But let's see here. I'm gonna get this thing to start reading from the current page.
Four unsuccessful attacks would erode confidence in the election process, providing opportunities to adversaries to cast doubt upon the legitimacy of both the process and results. Despite the diverse nature of the computer-enabled U.S. election infrastructure and the difficulties associated with anticipating decisive tipping points in advance in cases where an election is decided by a few closely contested areas that also employ vulnerable technologies, a targeted cyber attack on these locations might have significant impact on public confidence in the election or even actually be able to shift the overall outcome. If a perfect storm of coincident political and technological sensitivity were to develop, a cyber adversary might be able to target a small number of critical counties in highly contested states with significant numbers of electoral college votes. This could potentially alter the apparent outcome of, and almost certainly undermine public confidence in, the election. Although we understand this scenario is unlikely, it remains a possibility that we cannot discount. We judge that most adversaries could develop sufficient understanding of the U.S. political system to enable identification and targeting of the most contested or decisive locales and voting blocks. They might use this insight to focus and maximize the psychological impact of even minor cyber attacks on the election. Such attacks might be used to selectively disenfranchise, for example, by preemptively corrupting records of a particular group of voters or by manipulating public websites to give false information about the closure, relocation, or acts of violence at specific polling locations. Such misinformation might deter participation or flood some polling locations with more voters than they could support. Targeted cyber attacks might also be used to compromise the actual vote, or its tabulation, in precincts that employ vulnerable systems. Both state and non-state actors probably have the ability to determine, research, and defeat via remote or insider means selected systems. In some locations, adversaries could exploit open source information acquired via cyber theft, and commercially available bulk data sets to support targeting efforts against cyber-enabled election infrastructure. Adversaries could take advantage of a wide variety of open source information on emerging swing districts, county voting equipment, and other targeting details provided by news companies, voting rights organizations, and other non-government organizations, NGOs. For example, a U.S. news website reported in September 2016 that voters in 4 competitive states will cast ballots on electronic machines that leave no paper trail, and further noted that potential trouble spots include Pennsylvania, where the vast majority of counties still use ATM-style touchscreen voting machines without the paper backups that critics began demanding more than a decade ago. Adversaries could also use cyber espionage operations to obtain non-public information acquired from candidate campaign organizations, political parties, and state and local governments in issues like voting trends, election equipment, and vulnerable districts and systems. The IC does not know the details of the information stolen during recent Democratic National Committee, DNC.
Oh, I thought maybe it was going to go
5
on.
and Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, DCCC, hacks, but notes that open sources suggest sensitive, election-related, non-public information was obtained. Bulk data sets that might be used to identify key precincts or voting groups might be available from commercial data aggregation sources, either directly or via cyber espionage. In October 2015, a Russian-speaking cybercriminal was selling a database of PII from more than 190 million U.S. persons from 49 states, claiming that the data had been copied from a central server of the Election Commission. Russia, potential interest in disrupting U.S. election. Key judgment 4. We judge Russia has conducted cyber and intelligence operations that suggest that it has potential interest in disrupting the U.S. presidential election. Russia is probably the most capable and willing actor to conduct such operations based on its probable involvement in U.S. election-related disclosures, the downward trend of bilateral relationship, and Russian leaders deeply held belief that Washington has tried to influence past Russian elections. We assess that Russian intelligence services were behind the compromises of DNC and DCCC networks and of email accounts from members of Congress, state political parties of voter registration organization, and 7 other U.S. political organizations. We have high confidence in our assessment. Cyber operations are only one component of a multifaceted toolkit the Russians employ to influence the outcome of elections in other countries. Russia also uses general media messaging to promote or disparage candidates and other tools, some of which we judge would be more difficult for the Kremlin to replicate in the United States. See Annex C, Moscow's efforts to manipulate foreign elections, 2000-2016. Cyber influence operations that involve the release of compromising or embarrassing information, whether true or fabricated, are force multipliers for Moscow's media messaging. They can be used to grab headlines quickly in what is otherwise a very open and diverse U.S. media environment in which the Kremlin cannot control the message as easily as in other countries. We assess that the Russian services probably orchestrated at least some of the disclosures of DNC and DCCC documents from June to August 2016. Our assessment is based on timing of the disclosures and the fact that Russian intelligence was in possession of the leaked information from both the DNC and DCCC that the online persona Chipper 2.0 claimed to have provided FBI and NSA. However, have low confidence in the attribution of the data leaks to Russia. They agree that the disclosures appear consistent with what we might expect from Russian influence activities, but note that we lack sufficient technical details to correlate the information posted online to Russian state-sponsored actors. 6. If the disclosures of the DNC and DCCC documents were indeed orchestrated by the Russian intelligence services.
Hold on. What is it doing? Is it reading the same page over again? Where is it reading? Okay, this isn't going to work. Okay.
Those services would very likely have sought Putin's approval for the operation.
Okay.
We make this assessment because of the expected, high-profile nature of the resulting controversy, and the high likelihood that the disclosure would be linked to Russia because of open-source reports about Russian involvement in the DNC and DCCC hacks. Proposals for more routine Russian information operations might originate with the central apparatuses of intelligence services or their officers in the field, senior officials within Russian government entities such as the presidential administration, or from Kremlin-linked think tanks. The Kremlin's cyber penetration of a U.S. political party's servers and the timing of the probable subsequent leak of stolen data suggest that Russia is motivated to exploit the period surrounding the U.S. presidential election either to try to shape the U.S. political environment or to advance other Russian interests. For example, Putin may simply wish to make the U.S. electoral process appear illegitimate, or to undermine the legitimacy of the president-elect, in order to strengthen Moscow's hand. President Putin has the will and the authority in the Russian system to act forcefully and opportunistically and sometimes without planning for all the consequences, as he showed in occupying and annexing Crimea. The Kremlin probably expects that publicity surrounding the leaked party data will raise questions about the integrity of the U.S. political process, as Putin hinted in a recent interview. China, no indication of plans to use cyber operations to influence U.S. election. Key Judgment 5. We judge that although it has the means to do so, China is unlikely to publicly release materials that it might have collected from campaigns or candidates, and that it will probably not attempt to influence the outcome of the presidential election via cyber means. We make this judgment with only low confidence. Chinese cyber operators targeted the networks of candidates for the 2008 and 2012 presidential elections and exfiltrated candidates' emails. After the intrusions, China did not publicly release information. Recent reporting underscores China's ongoing interest in gaining insights into the policies of U.S. presidential candidates. 78 gigabytes, GB, of emails of a named presidential candidate, staff, and party officials. We assess that these emails refer to the records made public by WikiLeaks on July 22, based on the timing of the inquiry and the size of material. Other state actors' threat to U.S. election, possible but unlikely Iran might be motivated to try to undermine U.S. electoral legitimacy in retaliation for perceived U.S. hostility. Iran claims that the United States is failing to uphold the spirit of Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, and is increasingly aggressive against Iranian interests. Iran has previously leaked information that it thinks will damage or embarrass its adversaries and has used fake groups to claim credit for cyber operations. North Korea has a general intent to discredit and embarrass the United States. As a result, Pyongyang might view the election and transition period as a window of opportunity for its own agenda. However, North Korea's attack on Sony Entertainment in 2015 and its public release of personal and confidential information provides a template for similar operations should Pyongyang seek to influence the U.S. election. Foreign adversaries seeking to use stolen information as a means to influence or disrupt the U.S. election could use multiple online platforms such as WikiLeaks that have a record of protecting sources to avoid attribution. However, a state adversary would be likely to consider the risk of appearing to influence U.S. elections and the impact on its own public image if it were caught or implicated. Non-state actors with capabilities to influence U.S. election. Multiple non-state actors, including cyber activists and the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, might desire to disrupt the 2016 U.S. election to undermine the political legitimacy of the candidates based on these groups' past behavior. We have limited reporting suggesting some historic ISIL access to foreign voter databases, but we currently lack specific reporting to suggest that any non-state actor is either planning or preparing to disrupt the 2016 presidential election via a cyber attack. 8. Some companies conduct hacking for hire operations in support of political and commercial covert influence campaigns, which could empower unknown opponents. The Indian security company Appin has acted on the behalf of clients to delete or disrupt communications to influence public perceptions of political parties in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and Latin America. However, we lack reporting about either the planning or preparation for commercial hacking firms to be used against the U.S. presidential election in 2016.
So here's Annex A, possible state level election, network breaches and related intrusions. And I'll put this in the description so then you can come back and look at this if you'd like. Vulnerability of computer-enabled election systems to manipulation. Computer-enabled election systems are vulnerable to manipulation or disruption at various points, but redundancies in the system and problems with scale will probably make it difficult for cyber actors to affect the outcome of an election without being detected, especially a U.S. presidential election. Rather than trying to covertly change the actual outcome of an election, potential adversaries are more likely to use cyber operations against election systems to undermine the credibility of the process and weaken the perceived legitimacy of the winning candidate. Vulnerability to manipulation. So this is voter records. Okay, cyber actors could delete, manipulate, or deny access to voter records to selectively suppress voting. However, backup records can mitigate effects of such activity if manipulation is detected before voting starts. Domestic example of risk. States employ 3 methods of maintaining voter registration database: managed by state, managed by localities, or hybrid. State-managed systems have greater potential for larger scale manipulation due to the centralization of records. However, state-level cybersecurity is often better than that of localities. A recent compromise of state voter registration systems indicates theft of data rather than manipulation of records. Online ballot returns. These are often restricted to overseas citizens and are therefore limited in terms of scalability, but their online nature puts them at risk more than other computer-enabled parts of the election system. Alaska allows all voters to submit an absentee ballot electronically. 24 additional states, e.g. Colorado, Iowa, Missouri, North Carolina, District of Columbia, allow voters covered by the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act the UOCAVA, to submit ballots via email or internet portal. The Department of Defense projects 150,000 of these votes, and then 0.1% of ballots cast in 2012 will be submitted electronically in 2016. So, Annex B, vulnerability of computer-enabled election systems to manipulation, electronic voting systems. Electronic voting systems that do not provide a paper audit trail would provide the best opportunity to covertly manipulating the outcome of an election. However, they're usually not directly connected to the internet and will require a resource intensive supply chain, insider enabled, or close access operations to misregister votes or disrupt voting on a large scale. Domestic examples of risk: counties and parishes within 16 states. So Florida, Indiana, Louisiana, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Texas, Virginia employ electronic voting systems without a paper trail audit trail, excuse me. Although many of these jurisdictions employ other forms of voting as well, there are about 61.5 million registered voters who vote in these jurisdictions. Since the 2016 election, we have a paper that is printed out, like at the end. We're in Texas, so that's probably what it was before with the Dominion machines or whatever they were using. I don't even know, but we have paper now. But you fill it out on the screen and then it runs through the machine, just so you know. Okay, local or state compilation. Computer-enabled systems to tabulate votes recorded on paper-based ballots are often used to count votes at the local level. Almost every county in the United States employs computer-enabled tabulation of some kind, with some exceptions, e.g., where ballots are destroyed following initial optical scans, or in the case of paperless electronic voting machines, officials can recount by hand if verification checks suggest discrepancy in the tabulation process. Transmission to county or state election authorities. Denial of service attacks or other disruptive operations could temporarily disrupt online transmissions of vote results, but officials could use alternate means to share them, such as telephonically. Additionally, network-enabled systems that aggregate votes at the local, county, or state level are potentially vulnerable to manipulation, but discrepancies between tallies increase the likelihood that any large-scale manipulation would be exposed. And then most states rely on public telecommunications infrastructure to transmit vote results, although some have dedicated infrastructure that can be used. Centralized locations tabulating multiple precincts votes provide opportunities for larger scale vote manipulation. Some states are using cloud services, online infrastructure purchased from private sector providers to transmit results as well as to count and log votes. Public dissemination of voting results featuring national vote tallies are relatively accessible. Election authorities would notice the discrepancy and correct it quickly. Each state employs its own vote reporting system, generally called an election night reporting system. These systems can be vendor-provided solutions or developed by a state. Many states are cloud services to host results on election night because of the significant demand during that period. And then I'm going to stop here because, like I said, I'm getting kind of tired. But anyway, I will talk to y'all later. You have a good afternoon. Bye. See ya.